Welcome. I'm Edouard Machery, the director of the Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh and the host of the podcast Conversations at the Center. Today, my guest is Akos Szegofi, who is now a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, and who completed his PhD at Central European University in Vienna. Welcome, Akos.
Thank you very much for having me.
So maybe to get us started, maybe you can tell us a bit about what your research was during your PhD, what you're working on, and what your main interests are.
Certainly. So before my career in academia, I used to be a journalist, and I was a journalist around the time when fake news and misinformation and conspiracy theories again rose into the forefronts of academic and also public interest around 2015, 2016. Bunch of things happened. Brexit campaign, President Trump's first election win happened around that time as well. And there was this large-scale social fear about a new digital type of voter manipulation happening through fake news and happening through conspiracy theories. And I got interested in this primarily because I was a journalist, and then I started pursuing a career in academia. And basically, I got involved with my supervisor, who was a co-author of a psychological paper that basically said that humans actually have a capacity to check for the veracity of communicated information. They named this psychological capacity epistemic vigilance. And he basically put this paper in front of me on a table when I was talking to him about this technology panic and fake news and conspiracy theories and all this kind of stuff. And it was just, well, we think that humans are actually not really gullible and they have means to check whether information is true or not. How do you explain our results with what is going on in society? And basically that was my PhD. That's how it grew out.
Yeah, that's a fascinating topic. And of course, it does remain very timely and very relevant for our times today. And today, indeed, we're going to be talking about disinformation and epistemic vigilance throughout our podcast. Maybe one way to get us started is to contrast two views about maybe disinformation. One that says that we're gullible, and one that says that we're epistemically vigilant, and that how come we can be so easily misled. So maybe you can contrast these two views to get us started?
Sure. So I usually divide like the available academic literature into these two camps. One of them I like to call the naivists, who are basically thinking that humans are gullible. There are different shades of this argument with regards to how radical the argument is. There are some people who are thinking that we're just baseline accepting information, but really most of the social psychological literature would be in agreement that we have some kind of critical reasoning capacities, but these are really effortful and they need to be properly motivated and they can be extinguished fairly quickly. And then there is this other and because of this view, they would think that, obviously fake news is a huge problem for societies and they're responsible for a bunch of different societal evils and problems like democratic backsliding and populism and rise of far right and all these other kind of issues. And on the other hand, you would have the naivist camp, the vigilantist camp, who think that people are not particularly gullible. If anything, they're rather conservative about the information that they accept. And the problem is not really about them being too accepting to fake news, but not really being receptive of accurate information and failing to update their beliefs on that. And so they don't think that fake news or misinformation is a particularly huge problem. They do admit the fact that there might be something wrong going on with democratic backsliding, but they don't really think that fake news is a particularly strong explanation in this regard. And basically what I've been trying to do is to maneuver in between these two extreme viewpoints. And really the easiest way how I could visualize this for anyone is that imagine that your mind is a castle, and in order to get into this castle, a messenger to get into this castle, it would need to pass through a gate. And then there is a guard in front of that gate. Now, most of the psychological literature is agreement about the fact that there is some kind of a guard there. We're mostly on the same page about the abilities of this guard, I do think that the epistemic vigilance literature is doing a better job in explaining the duties and the abilities of this guard, but we're in disagreement about how this guard carries out its duties. So the naivist people would say that, well, if the guard is not properly motivated, or if the guard is not paid well enough, or if the guard is just tired, then whoever wants can basically just waltz into the castle and change the furniture and paint things on the walls and do whatever they want. And the epistemic vigilance camp would be saying that, well, really not what happens is that if the guard is absent for any reason, then the gates are closed and no information is going in. Whether it's accurate or whether it's inaccurate, there is no belief updating that takes place. And this is really the main disagreement right now about how these capacities work. Really, there would be some people who would debate the fact that there is a guard at the gate, but most of even the social psychological literature would be in agreement about the fact that there is something that we use to help. And there are good reasons to think that evolutionary reasons, historical reasons, and also like just empirical evidence, really.
Good. The naivist camp, as you described it, reminds me a little bit of so-called dual system theorists like Danny Kahneman.
Yes.
So I suppose these are this kind of views according to which the mind can work in, so to speak, two different ways.
Yes.
One which is use heuristics and very quick way to, let's say, make decisions, but also update our beliefs, and another way which involves a more reflective, more careful. That would be the metaphor. That would be what the guard really is on that view. Right?
System 1, System 2 processing, right?
Very, very good. So, and the vigilantists, maybe you can drop a few names to see exactly which kind of.
So that would be the main epistemic vigilance paper would be under the name of Dan Sperber. So he was the first author on the paper, and then he would have a variety of people working on it, like Gloria Riggi, who would be like mostly interested in reputation. My supervisor, Christoph Heinz, would be among one of the writers. And then the person who was working on it the most, probably apart from them, would be Hugo Mercier. So he also wrote a book specifically about misinformation and conspiracy theories and internet rumors from the epistemic vigilance standpoint and from the viewpoint of the vigilantist camp, trying to debunk some popular scientific and just general popular ideas about human gullibility. He also had a very successful PhD student that I also collaborated with, called Sasha Altai, and he's sort of like carrying the flag of this line of research, which is trying to look at critically about really what's going on with fake news and with misinformation. And I mean, obviously me coming from Hungary, it was always a little bit of a weird position for me, because especially working there as a journalist, it was weird for me how someone can claim that misinformation and fake news is not a problem. I mean, it was clearly wrong from my point of view, but over time I came to appreciate what they were saying. I still do believe that fake news can be dangerous and conspiracy theories can be dangerous, just perhaps not in the way how social psychologists would imagine it. So I think Hugo and the others were right about debunking that part, but there are other things as well that can work on people.
Good. That's a very nice way to get to my next question, which is indeed, what is your view? So, if it turns out that we have these capacities for assessing the truth likeliness or the truth of the messages we receive and the trustworthiness of the communicators or sources of information we are dealing with, how come there is misinformation? So what's your view? So what's in a sense, your middle way, your middle between, on the one hand, the naivist, and on the other hand, the vigilantist? So how do you make sense? Do you make sense of misinformation?
So my way of approaching this question, and I will really start with the methodology, because that's one of the things that was important for me. I found that both the vigilantist and the naivist camp was a little bit ahistorical, in a sense that they thought that they understood what disinformation and fake news has been used for professionally by state actors or by other people who were like professional fake news peddlers, in a sense, or fearmongers or populist politicians. They thought that they understood how it was being done, but really they haven't looked at the historical documentation about different kind of tactics and different kind of strategies. So my starting point was to go back to actual like Russian sources of disinformation to see what kind of techniques are available. Obviously, I wouldn't necessarily believe that these historical sources were right about what they were saying because they were not psychologists at the end of the day. So I would put these tactics and strategies in psychological experiments and see whether my results would be more in line with the vigilantist camp or would it be more in line with the naivist camp. And I found that even the professional fake news peddlers would have a pretty good understanding about the idea that humans are not so easily fooled, that it takes a lot of effort, that they need to educate people who are professionals in this field how to do it, and oftentimes it takes a lot of time. And no one is really going to change their mind because the headline that they saw on Facebook necessarily. This doesn't really happen in any meaningful way. So I found that their folk sort of understanding of human cognitive capacities is actually more aligned with the vigilantist camp, but they did have methods of exploiting this. And so really the main strategy that I found is something that, again, echoes in contemporary populist politics, is what I like to call flooding. So I said with the like sort of castle metaphor that I used at the beginning, that if the guard for any reason is overwhelmed or absent or something like that, then there is no information that's going in the castle, in the mind, and there is no belief updating that takes place. And contemporary digital technologies can be used to overwhelm the mind to the extent when people are just becoming confused about a topic. They wouldn't necessarily believe the fake news. They just look at the communication environment, see the amount of information that is there, people claiming A, people claiming non-A, people claiming all kinds of wild stuff, and they look at it and they try to assess how much work it would be for them, how much effort would it be for them to get informed about the topic, and then they just say, all right, you know what, I'm not even interested in politics. I'm not going to go to vote at the end of the day. And I think this is something that can be done with disinformation specifically. You just start putting out content. You don't want it to be even consistent with itself. Let it be inconsistent. Just flood the zone with media content, and people will get confused. And really, if I were to stay, for example, in US politics, then the goal of these professionals are oftentimes not to make a Republican voter be a Democrat voter or convince a Democrat voter to be a Republican using lies or using pieces of inaccurate information, but to confuse them up to the point where they would be unwilling to cast their votes on anyone. And that's a very, very dangerous method against democracies, because democracies rest fundamentally on participation of its citizens. And then there were also some smaller tactics that I have found that can be used to make false messages a little bit more believable as well. One of them is that I called dressing up, in which basically you're mixing accurate information with inaccurate information. You're not using the accurate information to argue for the veracity of the inaccurate information, but you're just presenting them at the same space, under the same source. And this is one very reliable way to exploit epistemic vigilance capacities that check on, like, it checks on the source and it checks on the content, and these evaluations are in interaction. And if you see a source communicating accurate information, then you would think that, well, this source really knows what it's talking about, so maybe there is something to the more inaccurate looking information that they're also communicating. And this was interesting for me. This is a very simple tactic that you can use, mixing false with true. It was the most usual thing that were referenced in these Russian documentations about disinformation tactics that I have found. But it was striking for me that whenever I looked at psychological studies about fake news, they only concentrated on the fakes, or then they only concentrating on the accurate messages. And they just seemingly disregarded the fact that these two things are mixed up on social media, and these two things are sort of mixed together whenever sources are communicating. And this was one of the things that I was trying to do. So I was looking at more of the strategic aspect of how this information is being used with regards to eliciting confusion, and then I looked at sort of like smaller tactics on how to make individual messages a little bit more believable. Yeah.
So let's focus a bit on the dressing up effect.
Sure.
You have a paper on that.
It's under review now.
It's under review now. Keeping my fingers crossed for you.
Thank you.
And it seems to have historical counterparts, right? It seems to be a commonly used tactics. You mentioned
Yes.
Russian propaganda, but it has been used throughout history.
Yes.
Right. That seems to be very. Could you give some examples?
Yeah, sure. So one of my favorite ones actually comes from France.
Uh-huh.
So I think it was President Macron's first election when there was an email leak that was posted on one of, I think, WikiLeaks maybe.
Correct. Yes.
And so basically what happened was that the people who were leaking this information had genuine emails from his camp, and then they would mix the fakes that were scandalous fakes among these messages that were actually true. And this is one of the instances where the simple presence of other emails that actually have nothing to do with the fakes, but seemingly coming from the same source, had an effect on how believable the fakes looked at the beginning. And obviously this poses a whole problem for interventions against fake news and interventions against these kind of efforts, because if you want to fact check this, then you also have to fact check the accurate information and explain it to people that the reason, why this is not that, or the reason why this looks believable is because of this or that, but it's actually not true. And at the end of the day, what you're generating is just more confusion for people, and to the point where they just don't know what to believe about these leaks anymore. And that was one of the goals that they wanted to elicit. So that's a very strong example of how dressing up was used together with a kind of flooding tactic to make the fakes a little bit more believable, but at the end of the day, really the goal was confusion. I would also say that on the bright side, I mean, it was a failed attempt in a sense that it did not hinder Macron from getting elected, despite of the fact that this was a clear attempt against his campaign. It still failed, so we can do things against it.
Okay, very interesting. So, as you mentioned earlier about your methodology, you look for historical strategies that actually seem to have been used, and people have somehow reflected a bit on why they're using it, and then you try to test them in the lab and try to model them to try to understand them formally why they might work. So maybe just still focusing on the dressing up effect. What did you do in the lab? If you can just tell us a few things.
Sure. So it was a simple experiment at the beginning, and then we just realized that there are many things that we have to control for. So we wrote a bunch of vignettes about a range of different topics. For this specific experiment, we did not include political information. So there were health topics, there were topics about biology, there were topics about history, there were even topics about arts, and we basically presented this in different conditions to our participants, and then we went on to test different hypotheses and different explanations that could be responsible. So, for example, we tested whether would it make any difference if the accurate information and the inaccurate information were communicated by two different sources. It still appears in the same environment, but the dressing up effect totally disappears. So it clearly has something to do with our participants updating their beliefs about the source, and this source trustworthiness bleeding into the evaluation of the inaccurate message. But really, one of my favorite things that we have done with it was that we really tried to put it under the test. So we gave people the chance to bet on the accuracy of information, to really motivate their critical thinking skills, their epistemic vigilance. Like the naivist camp would often say that if you're properly motivated, then you can really think things through critically, and that's when these abilities would be best. And we found that the dressing up effect still persisted despite of the fact that we gave monetary incentive to our participants to check for the veracity of information. So really, this was one of the strongest litmus tests that we could give. And usually, like these kind of motivators, they're usually not financial motivators. Even when the naivist camp is trying to do some intervention against fake news, when they're motivating people to think more critically about information, they usually don't pay them to do so. It's also something that's unfeasible on the level of like social media, for example. You cannot pay users to check for the veracity of information. It's just that's not going to work. But we did this, and this deception tactic still persisted. We also try to model it in silico with a co-author of mine from Munich called Oana Stanciu, and we found that basically a sequential type of Bayesian updating is possibly best to, which is what epistemic vigilance built on, is possibly best to explain it. We have entertained a bunch of different models that could account for our results, and we found this sequential updating to be possibly the best. Interestingly enough, also something that we found that was surprising is that the order of information didn't matter, which was a bit weird. So it doesn't really matter if a source presents the fake information first and then comes the accurate stuff, or vice versa. The main thing is that these things are being presented together.
An interesting aspect of your modeling effort is that dressing up effect is actually the consequence of rationality, of being a rational agent, right? So it's not a vice, it's not a failure, it's not a lack of motivation. It follows directly from the way a rational agent would actually update their beliefs by trying to assess the reliability or trustworthiness of their source of information, and having updated on true pieces of information somehow are more likely to accept false pieces of information about which they're uncertain. I mean, that's actually a very nice way of understanding the way epistemic vigilance is compatible with misinformation. Right? Somehow, epistemic vigilance does not mean that we cannot be misled.
Sure.
It just means that it's going to be misled in some interesting situations.
Yes. So in the original epistemic vigilance paper, and I think this is really the core of the whole thing, what I've been trying to do, the evolution and the development of epistemic vigilance capacity is understood as an arms race. There are always people in the cooperative venture who are trying to be exploitative and trying to lie to you for their own interest. And in order to combat that, people have evolved this epistemic vigilance capacity. The problem is that we also have evolving technology and evolving communication technologies. And whenever that happens, it sort of changes the opportunities of the people who are willing to exploit and the people who are willing to spread fake news. And whenever the communication environment changes due to technological innovation, the arms race is yet again reignited. And I think that this current post-truth era that some naivists like to call the post-truth era is really just the latest reiteration of this very, very old, probably millions of year olds of arms race in between vigilant communicators and then speakers who are maybe willing to exploit others for their own interest.
Good. That's a nice segue onto another topic you've been writing on, which is the existence of institutions, which are epistemic institutions. They allow us to have, so to speak, a better epistemic environment. And so that's a really interesting phenomenon. Could you just tell us a bit more about what you have in mind by these institutions?
Sure. So to continue on with the arms race metaphor, one of the things that humans have decided to do in order to handle the problem of misinformation and to handle the problem that partly technological innovations have created was to create institutions who would gather and verify sources and information for them in exchange of money and in exchange of reputation. And this is what we, in our paper with my supervisor, Christoph Heinz, called institutions of epistemic vigilance. And they're particularly interesting for us because, first of all, institutions of epistemic vigilance are, we say in the paper that they're more than a sum of their parts. And there is something about it which is very important also in contemporary politics, and this is that all the individual agents, let's say the journalists who are working at a newspaper, they all have their own political preferences, they all have their own political biases, they all have, their own voting patterns. And we are showing, and we also have evidence of the fact that if an institution of epistemic vigilance is working properly, then the output will not mirror the individual psychological biases of the agents that are working in the institution. And this is possible because the institution has its own methodology of how to gather sources, how to gather information, how to verify sources, how to verify information. And it also enforces these methodologies on its individual agents and is capable of debiasing the output that biased agents were creating and gathering in the first place if it works properly. And this is a real innovation in a sense that, you would have think that if all of these biased people are working together, they're most probably going to share the same biases because that's how they come together in the first place. So the output that they generate must be super biased at the end of the day. And there would be some people in both on the political right and the political left who say this is always the case. It's just the journalist is always biased. And what really a paper is saying, and what other people's paper is saying, is that it's not the politician. It's not the journalist who has to be unbiased. It's the methodology that they're using, which has to approximate some level of objectivity and communicate about it. And this is what institutions of epistemic vigilance are doing, and this is why we think they're particularly interesting for us. And in this current environment, when there's a lot of information, there's social media, that we're being bombarded with content every single minute of the day, and information seeks us out instead of us seeking out information, they're particularly important for curating these communication environments. Yeah.
So that's great. As you probably know, there are very similar views in philosophy of science about why science works. Individual scientists can be biased. In fact, they are bound to be biased. There's no other way. But science as an institution embodies something like a procedural rationality, that somehow the output of science is actually less biased than any individual agent.
Yes.
It's a very similar view, right?
Yes. I mean, we come from this kind of thinking. So I think my supervisor wrote about history of science a little bit as well, and we just sort of come from this tradition. And basically, we started applying this kind of framework, also distributed cognition and other topics to journalism. And there are even more similarities, like the logical positivism and falsifiability and all this kind of like the heritage of the Viennese circle is usually discussed in terms of this is what scientists are doing and this is how scientific logic works. But this is also how journalism works. If you don't have evidence of someone's wrongdoing, then they're innocent. This is basic Popperian thinking in journalism. This is also how legislative work is being done and also how courts are being done. But we have a lot to share with journalists as scientists, yes.
That's a really interesting observation. So there's very little philosophy. That's a bit of an aside. There's very little philosophy looking at journalism. I mean, the topic has become more of interest in philosophy over the last 5 years, in part related to concerns about misinformation and fake news. But it's an unexplored area of philosophy, and I think there's probably much more to be written there.
Possibly, yes.
Good. So a challenge, however, when one thinks about institutions meant to, in a way, sanitize our epistemic environment, is that it's hard to identify the good and the bad institutions.
Yes.
There are institutions that look like to be epistemic vigilance institutions, but in fact they're not. In fact, they are either flooding the zone or they are actually just doing some other things. Of course, it's not a new phenomenon. We had the yellow press a century ago.
Yes.
But when I think these days about some social media like Facebook and others, which are just, I'm not even sure they pretend to be epistemic vigilance institutions, but they are definitively not.
Yes.
So are we any good, or how do we go about identifying the right institutions?
Yeah, so you're pointing at a very, very prevalent problem in the epistemology of institutions, which is trusting institutions actually creates a regress. If you're trusting a doctor, you're also trusting the degree that a medical school gave to that doctor, and in order to trust the medical school, you have to trust that committee of the government that is overseeing educational matters. And it's just trusting institutions rely on other institutions that verify the work of the first institution, and then you just create a sort of infinite regress. This is not really how people think in reality, so they have tendency to stop after after the first 2 steps of verification or something like that. But yeah, it is an existing problem, and this is something that gets messed up whenever the communication technologies undergo some kind of a change or an innovation or evolution, that these verification chains suddenly become disrupted, and also the traditional markers that institutions are using to signal their own reputation and to signal that they're verified institutions can become hackable. So I have an example of how digital technologies have really changed everything. There was a CIA effort in the 1950s to hack the World Youth Communist Festival in East Berlin. And in order to do that, they decided that there is this youth newspaper called Junge Welt, and we're going to fake it, and we're going to create a newspaper that looks exactly like it, but it's going to have American propaganda in it instead of Soviet propaganda. And in order to do that, they had to borrow almost $1 million from the U.S. High Commissioner. They have to acquire printing presses, people who are capable of doing the work, and typesetters, and the physical distribution network, and 1 million copies of the newspaper, and then it all had to be kept in a underground in a basement. And nowadays, if you want to set up a website that looks exactly like the New York Times, you can probably do it in under 5 minutes. It has really become hackable of this kind of institutional output, and that's a huge challenge. There are modern meta institutions which are trying to do the work of giving ratings, almost like source ratings, to available journalistic institutions. So Ground News and NewsGuard are the 2 pioneers in this field, who just have a comprehensive set of dimensions over which journalistic institutions are evaluated, and they keep dynamically updating, and you can basically subscribe for their services, and it's going to generate a browser extension, and whenever you go on a web page, the NewsGuard is going to tell you, based on their metrics, how trustworthy it is, based on their track record of being good communicators in the past. And that is something that we're just sort of trying to do in order to keep our institutional output verifiable.
I mean, that's really interesting. That's also a place where science and journalism or the communication of information are very similar to one another. Over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of effort to assess, for example, scientific journals, to identify those that are good, those that are bad, exactly because we also have a flooding of information in science with many, a multiplication of journals. It's very similar, and there's a question about which to trust, and there are institutions that have emerged.
And there are predatory journals as well, which are trying to hack the entire system, trying to look like reputable outlets.
That's right.
And
So
they're very, very easy to set up as
It's a very similar situation, actually.
Yes.
The parallels are really quite interesting. All right, we don't want to end on a pessimistic note, so maybe let's try to end on an actionable, positive note. What kind of advice would you give our listeners for them to actually fight, if any, for them to resist misinformation or fake news?
So I think it was this co-author of mine, Hugo Mercier's former PhD student Sasha, who had a paper on how we should be concentrating on fighting for accurate information instead of concentrating on fakes. So it's been a known effect that if we come to believe that it's all fake news and all conspiracy theories out there, then we slowly but surely start decreasing our trust also in our electoral processes as well. And so I would just make effort to try to find reliable information. And really on an even more positive note, like it's been a heavy topic for me to keep concentrating on fake news for like several years during my PhD. It kind of weighs down on you at the end of the day. It's just human bullshit and digital trash that you're. But it really made me appreciate the role of trust in society. Societies are based on trust. The reason why we can be here and why we can be communicating with each other is that because we have solved problems like the ones that we're facing right now, and we solved it through trusting each other and keeping language and keeping our institutions safe. So, you know, in many occasions people are saying think more critically and be a little bit cynical. I would say no, be more trusting a little bit. That's the way out of this situation.
All right, that's a wonderful way to end our podcast today. Thanks, Akos. It was a
Thank you so
wonderful
much.
discussion. Thank you.